My name is Eleanor Brooks. I'm 37 years old, a wife, a professional, the kind of woman people trust without questioning why. I've been described as composed, reasonable, easy to live with, the woman who doesn't overreact, the one who keeps things running. In rooms full of louder voices, I was never invisible, but I was rarely centered. I listened carefully. I chose my words sparingly. I learned early that being calm made people comfortable, and being comfortable around me made them assume I was fine. From the outside, my marriage looked solid. No scandals, no dramatic conflicts, no public breakdowns. People used us as an example. They said we were balanced, mature, stable. What they didn't understand was that our stability depended on my silence. This isn't a story about sudden betrayal or explosive arguments. There was no single moment where everything shattered. It's a story about accumulation, about small moments dismissed as insignificant, about how being understanding slowly turns into being unseen. For years, I believed my restraint was a virtue, that swallowing my discomfort was part of being a good partner, that if I spoke too honestly, I would damage something fragile. And when I finally did speak, everything did fall apart. But not because I was wrong, and not because I was cruel. It fell apart because the structure had been relying on what I never said. I'm not telling this story to seek sympathy. I stayed longer than I should have. I taught people what I would tolerate. But I also observed. I paid attention. And when I stopped speaking, it wasn't out of fear. It was deliberate. This is not about revenge. There's no satisfaction here. It's about what happens when a woman who has always been quiet stops carrying what isn't hers anymore. If you've ever been praised for being strong when what you really were was silent, if you've ever confused peace with emotional absence, then this story may feel uncomfortably familiar. Before we begin, let me ask you something, just one thing. Have you ever wondered whether the calm in your life exists because of mutual respect or because you've learned not to ask for more? To the people around me, I was dependable in a way that rarely gets noticed. I wasn't the person you worried about. I wasn't the one who needed checking in on. If something needed to be done, I would handle it. Quietly, thoroughly, without reminding anyone later that it had ever been a burden. At work, I was the one managers trusted with complicated projects, but never felt the need to publicly praise. I made things run smoothly enough that people forgot chaos was even possible. When deadlines were met, no one asked how. When problems disappeared, no one wondered who had absorbed them. That role followed me home. In my marriage, I was seen as the steady one, the calm center, the emotional regulator. If something went wrong, people assumed I would adapt, and I usually did. I remembered birthdays. I tracked finances. I noticed moods before they turned into conflicts. I adjusted my expectations so conversations wouldn't become uncomfortable. I phrased concerns carefully, often softening them until they barely sounded like concerns at all. From the outside, I was easy to be married to. Inside the relationship, I was useful. I don't say that with bitterness. At the time, I didn't even recognize it as a problem. Being useful felt like being loved. Being needed felt close enough to being chosen. My husband often described me as low drama. He meant it as a compliment, and I accepted it as one. I didn't correct him when that phrase quietly translated into low priority. If plans changed, I adjusted. If decisions were made without me, I understood. If my preferences conflicted with convenience, I deferred. I told myself I was being mature. Friends admired our relationship. They said we communicated well because they never saw us argue. They said we were stable because nothing visibly shook us. They never asked what stability cost me, and I never volunteered the answer. When disagreements did arise, they were subtle. A raised eyebrow instead of a conversation. A joke that closed a topic before it opened. A decision presented as already finalized. And each time, I told myself it wasn't worth pushing back. That became my defining trait. Not worth pushing back. I was the woman people assumed would be fine. The one who didn't need reassurance. The one whose silence was interpreted as agreement rather than restraint. I remember sitting at dinners where conversations flowed around me, not to me, not intentionally excluding me, just naturally bypassing me. And I smiled. I nodded. I filled in gaps when needed. I made sure everyone else felt comfortable. No one ever asked if I was comfortable. And why would they? I had trained them well. I didn't demand space. I didn't insist on being heard. I didn't disrupt the rhythm of other people's lives. Over time, that became my identity. Reliable, supportive, invisible in ways that felt harmless. There was no cruelty in how people treated me. That's important to say. No one was overtly unkind. No one shouted or demeaned me. But there was a quiet assumption that I would always be there, always accommodating, always composed. And I was. Until one day, I realized that the version of myself they relied on only existed because I kept editing parts of myself out. I had become so skilled at minimizing my needs that people stopped recognizing them as real. That's who I was to them. Not weak, not powerless, just consistently overlooked. And the most unsettling part was this. I had helped create that version of myself. I taught people that my silence meant consent, that my calm meant capacity. That was my understanding meant endurance. At the time, I believed that was love. I didn't yet understand that love built on silence isn't stable. It's suspended. And suspension can last a long time, until the smallest cut appears. The first moment didn't feel important when it happened. That's what made it dangerous. It wasn't a betrayal or an argument. There was no raised voice, no sharp words that lingered in the air afterward. It was the kind of moment you'd describe as nothing if you were asked about it later. But I remember it clearly. We were at a small dinner with friends. Nothing formal. Just people we'd known for years, sitting around a table that felt familiar enough to relax into. Conversation moved easily, overlapping and unfinished in the way it does when everyone feels comfortable. At some point, the topic shifted to work, specifically, a project my husband had recently taken on. Someone asked him how it was going. He answered confidently, explaining the strategy, the timeline, and the challenges. As he spoke, I recognized the framework immediately. It was something we had discussed at length Late one evening at our kitchen table, I had laid out the risks, the sequence, the backup plan. As he talked, he used my words, not verbatim, but close enough that I felt it. I waited. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct him. I assumed naturally that at some point he would say something like, "Actually, Eleanor helped me think through that." He didn't. No one noticed. No one questioned it. The conversation moved on, seamless and smooth, and my contribution dissolved into the air without resistance. I smiled. I sipped my drink. I told myself it didn't matter. After all, I wasn't the one on that project. I didn't need credit. I wasn't insecure. I wasn't petty. That was the internal monologue I had perfected over the years. Later that night, as we drove home, I almost mentioned it. The words formed easily enough. It would have been a small comment, light, casual, something like, "You know that plan you explained earlier? We'd talked through that together." But I didn't say it. I told myself I was being generous, supportive, that couples don't keep score. The truth was simpler. I didn't want to create tension over something that everyone else had already forgotten. But I didn't forget. I didn't replay the moment obsessively. I didn't feel angry. What I felt was quieter than that. Displacement. A subtle awareness that something of mine had been lifted and carried elsewhere without acknowledgement. In the days that followed, nothing changed outwardly. My husband didn't behave differently. Our routines continued uninterrupted. The world offered no indication that a line had been crossed, which made it easy to dismiss the feeling. Except it lingered, not as resentment, but as a note in the back of my mind. A reminder that my presence was optional, that my role was supportive, not central. What unsettled me most was not that he took credit. It was how natural it had felt for him to do so. As if the idea belonged to him the moment it left my mouth. As if my contribution was part of the background noise of his success. Useful, but not worth naming. I wondered if I was being overly sensitive. I considered all the ways I might be misinterpreting the moment. I thought about the many times he had supported me in quieter ways. And I decided, again, not to speak. That decision felt responsible at the time. But something changed internally. From that moment on, I began to notice how often my input was absorbed without recognition. How often were presented as conclusions rather than conversations. How often my agreement was assumed because I hadn't objected quickly enough. The first cut didn't hurt. It didn't bleed. It didn't demand attention. It simply marked a place where something had been taken for granted and not given back. And because I stayed silent, that cut was never acknowledged. This taught everyone, including myself, that it was acceptable. That was the moment I stopped assuming my silence was invisible. I realized it was being interpreted as permission. After that first moment, nothing dramatic followed. That's how normalization works. It doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly, repeating small behaviors until they no longer feel worth mentioning. The next instances were subtle enough to dismiss individually. A decision was made without consulting me because it just made sense. A conversation that continued past me, as if my input would slow things down. Plans were discussed in front of me, as though I were already in agreement. Each time, I felt the familiar impulse to speak, and then the practiced instinct to swallow it. I told myself I was choosing peace. At first, it felt reasonable, healthy even. Relationships require flexibility. Not every thought needs to be voiced. Not every preference deserves center stage. That logic became my shield. When my husband summarized conversations we'd had privately as conclusions he'd reached on his own, I let it go. When he described shared sacrifices as personal efforts, I reminded myself that intent mattered more than credit. When he used phrases like, "We don't need to overthink this," in response to my questions, I reframed it as efficiency, not dismissal. I became very good at reinterpretation. The problem with reinterpretation is that it trains you to doubt your instincts. Each time I minimized a moment that felt off, I pushed the boundary of what felt acceptable a little further away from myself. And because I didn't push back, the behavior didn't register as disrespect to anyone else. It simply became the dynamic. I noticed how often my silence was treated as confirmation. If I didn't object immediately, the topic was considered closed. If I hesitated, it was assumed I didn't care. So I began responding faster, but not more honestly. I learned how to agree without enthusiasm, how to nod without commitment, how to express concern in ways that sound like afterthoughts. I told myself this was emotional intelligence, but it was emotional containment. At social gatherings, people addressed questions to my husband, even when they involved shared experiences. When opinions were needed, his were treated as definitive, mine as supplementary. No one meant harm. That was the most confusing part. There was no malice, no cruelty to point to, just a pattern reinforced by my quiet. And over time, I noticed something else. The less I spoke up, the more confident others became in speaking for me. He doesn't mind. She's fine with it. We already talked about it. Sometimes those statements were true because I had agreed in the shallowest possible way. Other times, they were assumptions made because I hadn't challenged them before. I began to recognize the role I had been assigned. I was the stabilizer, the one who absorbed the inconvenience, the one who made the compromises invisible. And because I was good at it, people expected it. What troubled me wasn't that I wasn't being heard. It was that I had become predictable. My reactions, my tolerance, my willingness to adapt, none of it surprised anyone anymore. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me quiet in a different way. I stopped believing that speaking up would lead to understanding. I began to believe it would only lead to being seen as difficult. So I adjusted. I lowered expectations, not of others, but of myself. I told myself I didn't need acknowledgement, that my satisfaction came from knowing I'd done the right thing, that integrity mattered more than recognition. And in many ways, that was true. But something else was happening beneath that reasoning. Each unchallenged dismissal made the next one easier. Each rationalization smoothed the path for repetition. Disrespect didn't arrive loudly. It arrived dressed as efficiency, as practicality, as comfort. And because I had already demonstrated that I would tolerate it, there was no incentive for anyone to stop. I wasn't being mistreated. I was being utilized. That distinction took me a long time to see. The most unsettling part was how normal it all began to feel. The absence of my voice didn't register as a loss to anyone but me. I would catch myself mid thought, preparing to speak, and then stop. Not because I feared the response, but because I had learned the outcome. The conversation would continue without adjusting. So I learned to adjust instead. That's how disrespect becomes routine. Not through a single decisive moment, but through repeated silences that teach others exactly how much of you they can take and how little they need to give back. There's a moment when you realize that people aren't reacting to who you are anymore, they're responding to who they expect you to be. That realization didn't come to me all at once. It surfaced gradually, in the way patterns do when you stop excusing them. I began to see how predictably others interacted with me. Not unkindly, not dismissively in an obvious way, but with a quiet certainty. They knew I would be agreeable. They knew I would adapt. They knew I wouldn't disrupt the flow. And because they knew that, they stopped checking. In my marriage, the role was clear. I was the one who made things easier. If something was inconvenient, I absorbed it. If a schedule needed rearranging, mine moved first. If emotions ran high, I smoothed them down, not by addressing them, but by managing my own. It wasn't something my husband demanded outright. It was something he grew accustomed to. Over time, expectations solidify. What begins as appreciation quietly becomes entitlement. He didn't ask if I could take something on anymore. He assumed I would. He didn't pause to consider my capacity. He trusted it was there. I had become the infrastructure of our life together, invisible when it worked, noticeable only when it didn't. The more I observed, the clearer the role became. I wasn't the decision maker. I was the confirmer. I wasn't the partner consulted at the beginning. I was the one informed at the end. My input was welcomed, as long as it didn't require recalibration. When I questioned something, the response was often gentle but final. It's already handled. We don't need to complicate it. This is just easier. Easier for whom was never discussed. I began to understand that my value in the relationship had become conditional, not on who I was, but on how seamlessly I supported what was already decided. That realization wasn't painful in the dramatic sense. It was clarifying. I could see how my consistency had shaped expectations, how my willingness to be flexible had taught others where I would bend, how my silence had been interpreted not as patience, but as permission. The role extended beyond my marriage. At work, I was the one people relied on to fix issues quietly, to step in without recognition, to make sure things didn't fall apart behind the scenes. I was never in danger of being replaced, but I was rarely in danger of being promoted because I made things function too smoothly to be disruptive. I had become indispensable in the most limiting way. And here's the part that mattered most. No one assigned me this role maliciously. I accepted it incrementally. Each time I chose not to speak, I reinforced it. Each time I downplayed my needs, I confirmed it. Each time I prioritized harmony over honesty, I secured my position in it. By the time I fully recognized the role, it was already established. People interacted with me based on an internal script, and any deviation from it felt unnecessary to them. But for the first time, I didn't feel resentful. I felt aware. I saw how the role protected others from discomfort, how it allowed them to move faster, decide more easily, and feel more certain. And I saw the cost, the role required, that I remain composed even when I felt overlooked, that I stay helpful even when I feel diminished, that I be understanding even when understanding was no longer reciprocal. It required me to stay small in very specific ways. Once I saw it clearly, I understood something else. Roles only function as long as everyone keeps playing them. And for the first time, I considered what might happen if I didn't. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. That thought didn't scare me. It grounded me. Because I realized I wasn't trapped. I was simply consistent. And consistency can be changed. The day something shifted didn't look like a turning point. There was no argument, no raised voices, no decisive moment where I finally said what I'd been holding back. It was an ordinary day, quiet enough that I almost dismissed it as insignificant. I was sitting alone at the kitchen table in the early evening. The light outside was fading, that in-between hour where everything feels suspended. I had just finished reviewing our monthly finances, something I had always handled without much discussion. Spreadsheets open, numbers aligned, patterns clear. I wasn't upset. I wasn't searching for proof of anything. I was simply doing what I always did. But as I moved through the accounts, I noticed how many decisions had been made without my direct involvement. Adjustments, commitments, small financial choices that individually weren't alarming, but collectively formed a picture. Not of recklessness, of assumption. There was an unspoken certainty that I would manage the consequences, that I would make it work. I closed the laptop and sat back. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't immediately justify it. I didn't say, he's busy. I didn't say it's not worth a conversation. I didn't say, this is just how partnerships work. I just let the observation exist. What followed wasn't anger. It was a distance, a subtle emotional step back, as if I had shifted my weight and realized I'd been leaning too far forward for too long. I began replaying small moments, not to judge them, but to see them clearly. How often I adjusted my schedule without being asked. How often were framed as updates rather than discussions. How often my agreement was inferred from my silence. I realized something that stopped me cold. No one was intentionally ignoring me. They simply believed I didn't need to be consulted. And I had taught them that. That thought didn't feel heavy. It felt precise. I saw how my silence had created efficiency for everyone else and invisibility for me. That night, when my husband came home, nothing outwardly changed. We talked about our days, we ate dinner, we followed the rhythm we had perfected. But inside, something had settled. I didn't bring up the finances. I didn't mention what I'd noticed. I didn't correct anything. Not because I was afraid, but because I wasn't ready to speak yet. For the first time, my silence wasn't avoidance. It was intentional. I began to listen differently. Not for reassurance, but for information. I noticed how confidently decisions were explained after the fact. How comfortable others were assuming my support. How rarely anyone checked for my actual opinion. And instead of reacting, I observed. That was the shift. I stopped seeing these moments as personal slights and started seeing them as data. Patterns reveal themselves when you stop interfering with them. Over the following weeks, I became quieter, but more present, less reactive, more attentive. I didn't withdraw emotionally. I simply stopped filling in gaps that weren't mine to fill. I realized I had been managing not just logistics, but emotional equilibrium for both of us. And I wondered, calmly, what would happen if I didn't? This wasn't a decision to leave. It wasn't a plan to confront. It wasn't even dissatisfaction exactly. It was clarity. I saw my role from the outside for the first time. And once you see something clearly, you can't unsee it. That evening at the kitchen table didn't change my marriage. It changed my position within it. I stopped assuming responsibility for things I hadn't chosen. I stopped smoothing over decisions I hadn't been part of. I didn't announce the shift. I didn't need to. Because shifts like this don't make noise. They change direction. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reflexive, an automatic response shaped by habit and fear of disruption. I stayed quiet because it felt easier, safer, more responsible. Now, my silence was deliberate. I didn't announce this change. I didn't correct anyone's assumptions. I simply stopped offering what hadn't been requested and stopped volunteering for an agreement before it was earned. At first, nothing seemed different. Conversations continued as they always had. Decisions were still presented as updates rather than discussions. My husband spoke with the same confidence, the same ease. But I began to notice something subtle. When I didn't immediately step in to stabilize the situation, there was a pause. When I didn't anticipate needs before they were expressed, there was mild confusion. When I listened without smoothing the edges, conversations felt unfinished. People are accustomed to roles being fulfilled. When one isn't, even briefly, the absence registers. I didn't fill it. I responded politely, calmly, but minimally. I asked neutral questions instead of offering solutions. I acknowledged information without endorsing it. Okay, I see. Let me think about that. These weren't confrontational statements. They didn't challenge authority or demand change. But they removed something essential: automatic support. Others interpreted my restraint in predictable ways. Some assumed I was tired. Some assumed I was distracted. Some assumed I didn't care as much anymore. No one assumed I was paying closer attention than ever. That was the advantage of being underestimated. Because my quiet had always been read as passivity, my intentional silence blended seamlessly into the background. I stopped reminding my husband of deadlines that weren't mine. I stopped reorganizing plans that had been made without me. I stopped preemptively absorbing stress, not to punish, to observe. And what I observed was instructive. Without my constant adjustments, small inconveniences began to surface. Nothing catastrophic, just enough friction to reveal dependencies that had gone unnoticed. I realized how often I had been compensating, not for lack of care, but for lack of awareness. And still, I said nothing. I wasn't building resentment, I was building understanding. The more I withheld commentary, the more space I created for myself. That space was uncomfortable at first. I had spent years equating value with usefulness. Being less useful triggered old instincts to overcorrect, but I resisted them. I reminded myself silence does not mean absence, it means restraint. Over time, my husband began to mistake my calm for indifference. He became slightly more assertive, slightly more certain, because people tend to fill the silence with their own confidence. That worked in my favor. I learned how decisions were justified, how assumptions were made, how quickly things moved forward when no resistance appeared. And I took note. My silence was no longer a shield, it was a lens. I began documenting, not dramatically, not obsessively, just enough to preserve accuracy. Dates, conversations, decisions presented as facts, not to build a case, to maintain clarity. There's a difference. I also began making small internal shifts. I reviewed finances more carefully. I updated my personal records. I reacquainted myself with options I hadn't needed to consider before. No one noticed. Why would they? Nothing looked different. I was still calm, still supportive in appearance, still present. But I was no longer cushioning the impact of choices that weren't mutual. And that changed the dynamic in ways that wouldn't be visible until much later. Silence, when chosen, is powerful because it doesn't provoke defense. It invites assumption. An assumption reveals structure. I wasn't withdrawing. I was repositioning quietly. What people never notice about quiet individuals is not that they lack awareness, it's that they collect it. When you stop speaking automatically, you start seeing patterns that were previously blurred by participation. That's what happened to me. Because I wasn't filling the silence anymore, I could hear what occupied it. I noticed how often decisions were framed as inevitabilities, not choices, outcomes, how language softened accountability. Phrases like, it just happened, or that's how it worked out, replaced direct ownership. I noticed how frequently my husband referenced our life when it benefited him, and his when it required responsibility. How shared effort became individual accomplishment in public, and individual inconvenience became shared expectation in private. These weren't new behaviors, they were simply unexamined before. I also noticed how confidently others spoke on my behalf. Statements about what I wanted, what I preferred, and what I was fine with were delivered without hesitation. And because I didn't immediately correct them, those statements solidified into facts. That was the part no one questioned. I began to document everything, not in a dramatic way, not out of suspicion, just with precision. Dates, times, decisions presented as mutual that weren't. Financial commitments I hadn't explicitly agreed to. Conversations where my silence was interpreted as consent. I wasn't building a narrative. I was preserving accuracy. There's a difference between memory and record. Memory softens, records don't. I also began learning, quietly, methodically. I revisited our legal and financial structures, not because I intended to act, but because I wanted to understand. I reviewed documents I had signed years ago without question. I familiarized myself with policies, timelines, and implications. None of this felt urgent. It felt responsible. I also paid attention to emotional dynamics. How often is it expected to regulate mood? How quickly discomfort was redirected toward me to resolve? And I stopped doing that work. Not overtly, not confrontationally. I simply allowed discomfort to exist. That alone shifted things. People grow accustomed to equilibrium without realizing who maintains it. When that maintenance pauses, even briefly, confusion follows. But confusion isn't an accusation, it's data. I noticed how quickly my absence from emotional management created tension. Not because I was needed emotionally, but because my presence had previously removed the need for others to self correct. That realization was sobering. I also noticed how little curiosity there was about my inner life. How few questions were asked once I stopped offering insights voluntarily. The silence was not met with concern, it was met with assumption. An assumption told me everything I needed to know. Meanwhile, outwardly, nothing had changed. We still shared meals, we still attended events, I still showed up where expected. The difference was internal. I had stopped investing blindly. I began redirecting attention toward myself. Not indulgently, strategically. I updated my professional profile, reconnected with contacts I had let fade, took note of opportunities without pursuing them yet. I wasn't preparing to leave. I was preparing to choose. That distinction mattered. I also stopped correcting misunderstandings that didn't harm me. When people misrepresented my opinions in minor ways, I let it stand. Why? Because correction would have restored the illusion of participation. I wanted to see how far assumptions would travel without reinforcement. The answer was very far. People grew increasingly comfortable making decisions without me. And in doing so, they revealed exactly how replaceable they believed my role was. That belief would become important later. At the time, it simply clarified the stakes. What they never noticed was that my quiet was no longer passive. I wasn't disengaged. I was repositioned. I had moved from participant to observer, from stabilizer to analyst. And analysts don't interrupt the process. They let it reveal itself. Every unchecked assumption, every unacknowledged contribution, every decision made in my name without my voice, it all added structure to a picture I hadn't been able to see before. I didn't feel angry. I felt prepared. Because once you understand the system you're in, you no longer need to fight it. You just need to decide when to stop supporting it. The reveal wasn't dramatic. There was no moment where everything suddenly made sense. No sharp intake of breath, no rush of adrenaline. What came instead was something quieter and far more permanent. Clarity. It happened late one evening, alone, with documents spread across the dining table. Not because I suspected anything specific, but because I had developed a habit of understanding the full shape of things before trusting them. I was reviewing our long-term financial structure, accounts, obligations, timelines. The kind of review most people avoid because it feels tedious or unnecessary. But patterns live in details. And that night, I saw one clearly. The structure of our shared life depended disproportionately on my consistency, not emotionally, logistically. I saw how many safeguards existed because I had put them there, how many buffers assumed my oversight, how many decisions relied on my follow through rather than mutual agreement. It wasn't exploitation in the obvious sense, it was reliance without acknowledgement. And more importantly, it was reliance without redundancy. If I stopped compensating, things wouldn't collapse immediately, but they would drift. And drifting, over time, becomes exposure. That was the private reveal. Not that I was being mistreated, but that I was carrying more leverage than anyone realized, including myself. I saw how my silence had allowed others to overestimate their independence, how my steady presence had disguised the imbalance as harmony. And I understood something essential. The system worked because I made it work, not because it was fair, not because it was resilient, but because I was consistent. That knowledge didn't empower me in the way people imagine power. It grounded me. Because leverage doesn't need to be announced. It only needs to be understood. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt responsible. Responsible for what I would do with that understanding. I didn't confront anyone. There was no need. Confrontation would have invited defensiveness. And I wasn't interested in explanations anymore. I wasn't trying to change behavior. I was deciding what I would no longer sustain. Over the following days, I made small adjustments, quiet ones. I separated visibility from responsibility. I ensured my personal records were complete. I reviewed timelines with fresh eyes, not as obligations, but as options. I didn't move money. I didn't issue ultimatums. I didn't hint at dissatisfaction. I simply stopped assuming permanence. And that changed how I saw everything. I realized how often I had been operating under the belief that endurance equaled loyalty. That stability required sacrifice without recognition. That belief dissolved quietly. In its place came a more accurate one. Endurance without reciprocity is not commitment. It's maintenance, and maintenance can be discontinued. That realization didn't make me cold. It made me calm. I began to understand why my eventual voice would be destabilizing. Not because it would be loud, but because it would interrupt a structure that relied on my quiet. I also understood why timing mattered. Speaking too early would invite negotiation. Speaking too late would invite resentment. I wasn't interested in either. The reveal gave me something more valuable than certainty. It gave me patience. I no longer needed reassurance. I no longer needed validation. I no longer needed to be seen in order to see clearly. And because no one knew what I had realized, nothing changed on the surface. That was the advantage. People continued as before. Assumptions persisted. Confidence remained unchallenged, which meant the system continued to expose itself. Every decision made without me confirmed the pattern. Every overlooked contribution reinforced the imbalance. And every day I chose not to intervene strengthened my resolve. Not because I wanted things to fail, but because I needed to see whether they could stand without my silent support. The answer was forming, slowly, quietly, irrefutably. The private reveal wasn't about discovering betrayal. It was about discovering the truth. And once you have that, You don't rush. You prepare. There comes a point where observation turns into responsibility. You can't unknow what you've learned. And once clarity settles in, continuing as before becomes a choice rather than a default. That was where I found myself. I didn't arrive at the decision point in distress. There was no emotional pressure forcing my hand. In many ways, that made it more difficult. Nothing was wrong enough to justify action in the way people expect. And yet, everything was clear enough that inaction felt dishonest. I began laying out the options, not emotionally, but practically. The first option was to speak up fully, to articulate everything I had noticed, everything I had carried, everything that had gone unacknowledged, to ask for a change. I understood that option well. It was the one most people would recommend. Honest conversation, emotional transparency, repair through communication. But I also understood its limitations. That conversation would have framed the issue as a misunderstanding rather than a structure. It would have invited reassurance rather than re-evaluation. It would have asked the system to adjust without challenging its foundation. More importantly, it would have required me to continue explaining myself. And I was done explaining. The second option was to continue as I had been, to accept the imbalance as the cost of stability, to remain essential but unrecognized. I knew I could do that. I had already proven it, but I also knew what it would cost. Resentment doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it settles in as numbness, as distance, as a slow withdrawal from yourself. I wasn't willing to become that version of me. The third option was the one that felt irreversible. To stop sustaining what wasn't mutual. To step out of the role without announcing it. To allow consequences to emerge naturally, not as punishment, as reality. This option didn't involve confrontation. It didn't involve demands. It didn't involve doing anyone wrong. It involved withdrawal of unreciprocated labor. I understood that once I chose it, things would change in ways I couldn't control. Confusion would surface, tension would appear, questions would be asked. But I also knew that whatever followed would be honest. Because systems reveal their truth when support is removed. I took my time with this decision. Weeks passed. Life continued. Nothing forced urgency. That patience mattered. I paid attention to my own state. I checked for anger, for spite, for a desire to win. None of those were present. What I felt was steadiness, the kind that doesn't need justification. I realized I wasn't trying to end anything. I was trying to stop pretending. That was the point where the decision became clear. I chose not to announce my needs. I chose not to negotiate terms. I chose not to argue for fairness. I chose to act in alignment with what I now knew, quietly. That meant allowing others to experience the absence of what I had previously provided automatically. It meant letting misunderstandings stand until someone chose to clarify them. It meant no longer stepping in to protect comfort at my own expense. It also meant preparing for outcomes without rehearsing conversations. I ensured my autonomy was intact, that my resources were accessible, that my professional footing was secure, not as an escape plan. as self respect. The decision point wasn't about choosing between staying and leaving, it was about choosing between self erasure and self alignment. Once that choice was made, the rest followed naturally. I didn't feel brave, I felt settled. Because courage often looks loud from the outside, but from within, it feels like quiet relief. The moment I chose, nothing visible happened. No one sensed the shift. But internally, the dynamic had already changed. From that point forward, everything that unfolded would do so without my interference. And that was the most honest thing I could offer. Once the decision was made, there was no rush. That's something people misunderstand about quiet change. They assume it's fueled by urgency or emotion. In reality, it's guided by timing. I didn't announce anything. I didn't hint. I didn't shift my tone or behavior dramatically. I simply began moving in alignment with my own interests, without explanation. At a practical level, that meant I stopped managing what wasn't explicitly shared. I separated joint responsibilities from assumed ones. If a decision didn't involve me directly, I didn't preemptively accommodate it. I reviewed the agreements carefully. I clarified details only when necessary. I ensured my name was attached only to what I had consciously agreed to. At work, I became more precise. I documented processes I had previously handled intuitively. I stopped absorbing last-minute changes unless they were formally acknowledged. I made my contributions visible, not loudly, but clearly. No one objected. Why would they? Nothing looked confrontational. In my marriage, I maintained the same calm demeanor. Meals were shared. Conversations continued. Routine held. But I no longer filled silence with reassurance. I no longer corrected course midstream. I no longer anticipated needs that hadn't been voiced. This wasn't withdrawal, it was boundaries without announcement. And because I had always been consistent, the absence of my quiet interventions didn't immediately register as intentional. It was mistaken for circumstance. People assumed things were busy, that timing was off, that I would step in later. I didn't. Behind the scenes, I made sure my footing was solid. I confirmed access to accounts. I organized records. I updated contingency plans that had once felt unnecessary. Not because I expected conflict, but because clarity demands preparedness. I also adjusted emotionally. I stopped monitoring reactions. I stopped calibrating my tone to avoid discomfort. I allowed conversations to land where they landed. That was new. I noticed how quickly others grew uneasy when things didn't resolve smoothly, how accustomed they were to me bridging gaps without being asked. But I remained calm. Silence doesn't provoke when it's steady. The most important shift was internal. I stopped seeking confirmation that I was doing the right thing. I trusted the alignment. When you move in silence, you don't look for permission. You move based on internal coherence, not external approval. Weeks passed. Small consequences began to surface, not dramatically, but noticeably. Minor miscommunications, slight delays, unfinished details, nothing alarming, just enough to feel. And still, I said nothing. Because I wasn't trying to expose anything. I was allowing reality to function without my reinforcement. The strength of this approach was its neutrality. No accusations, no defensiveness, no emotional escalation, just cause and effect. I understood that once people noticed the absence, they would search for reasons. They would assume stress, distraction, and external pressure. What they wouldn't assume, yet, was intent. That worked in my favor. Moving in silence protects you from interference. It allows actions to complete before opinions form. And by the time questions arise, the groundwork is already laid. I didn't feel secretive. I felt discreet. There's a difference. Secrecy hides motives. Discretion respects timing. I wasn't hiding what I was doing. I simply wasn't announcing it. Because the truth was this: if I had needed to explain my actions for them to be valid, they wouldn't have been aligned. Silence allowed the transition to remain clean. No arguments, no ultimatums, no justifications, just movement. And with each quiet step, I felt lighter. Not because things were ending, but because I was no longer carrying what wasn't mine. That was when I knew I had chosen correctly. Not because anyone reacted, but because I no longer needed them to. Consequences rarely announce themselves as consequences. They arrive disguised as an inconvenience, as confusion. There is a subtle sense that something is off, even if no one can quite say what it is. That's how it began. Small things started slipping through the cracks that had never been visible before. Details that used to resolve themselves quietly remained unfinished. Decisions that once moved smoothly stalled in minor but noticeable ways. Nothing serious, nothing urgent. Just enough friction to interrupt the illusion of effortlessness. At first, the reaction was denial. My husband assumed it was temporary, a busy week, a missed detail, something he would circle back to later. He didn't ask me directly. He didn't need to. The assumption was that I would eventually step in. I didn't. Then came mild irritation, not directed at me, but at circumstances. Schedules, timing, external pressures. The discomfort was real, but the source was still invisible. Because when you're accustomed to someone quietly absorbing the weight, you don't immediately recognize what's missing. You just feel heavier. I noticed the change in tone before I noticed it in words. More sighs, shorter patience, a need to explain things out loud that had previously been seamless. Still, no one connected it to me. That was the most telling part. The system had relied on my presence so thoroughly that my absence wasn't yet associated with cause, only effect. At work, something similar happened. Without my quiet corrections, processes became slightly less efficient. Not enough to fail, enough to be felt. People asked more questions. Meetings ran longer. Follow-ups became necessary. Still, no one accused me of disengaging. Why would they? I was still doing my job, just not everyone else's. The discomfort spread slowly. And because it wasn't dramatic, it couldn't be confronted head on. There was no obvious conflict to resolve, no clear person to blame, which made it harder to fix. That's when the first real shift occurred. Questions began to surface. Not about me, but around me. Did we already decide this? Who was handling that? I thought that was taken care of. Each question carried a quiet realization. Something that had once been automatic was now uncertain, and uncertainty unsettles people more than conflict. I remained calm, present, responsive, within reason. But I didn't rush to restore equilibrium. I answered questions honestly, without cushioning. I'm not sure. I don't think that was finalized. I wasn't involved in that decision. Those statements weren't accusations, they were facts. And facts, when introduced into a system built on assumptions, are destabilizing. My husband began to notice the friction more directly. He mentioned feeling overwhelmed. Things have felt more complicated lately. He didn't ask why. He assumed complexity had increased externally, not that support had been withdrawn internally. That assumption was revealing, because it meant he still didn't see the structure, only the strain. I listened. I acknowledged his feelings. I didn't rush to solve them. For the first time, I allowed his discomfort to exist without immediately neutralizing it. That was new for both of us. The consequences weren't punishment, they were exposed. Exposure of how much invisible labor had been holding things together, how little redundancy existed, how much had depended on my quiet compliance. And the most important part, I didn't feel satisfaction watching this unfold. I felt neutral. Because this wasn't about watching someone struggle. It was about seeing reality function without distortion. As weeks passed, the tone shifted again, from irritation to concern. Don't panic yet, but awareness. The ease we had once taken for granted no longer felt guaranteed. Something had changed, even if it couldn't yet be named. And still, no one confronted me. Not because they didn't feel it, but because they didn't yet understand it. That's the nature of quiet consequences. They don't point outward, they force inward reflection. And reflection is uncomfortable when it wasn't chosen. I knew then that we had crossed a threshold. The system was no longer self sustaining, and whatever came next would require acknowledgement or collapse. There would be no return to before, not because I had done anything dramatic, but because I had stopped doing something essential. By the time they realized something was wrong, the window for fixing it had already closed. Not because I refused to talk, not because I shut anyone out, but because the issue was no longer a misunderstanding. It was structural. The first attempt to fix things came quietly. Casual comments framed as concern. Suggestions delivered lightly, as if nothing fundamental was at stake. My husband started asking questions he'd never asked before. Are you okay lately? You seem a little distant. Did I do something? These questions didn't come with curiosity. They came with urgency, with the subtle expectation that whatever had shifted could be named, smoothed over, and restored to normal. I answered honestly, but narrowly. I'm fine. I've just been focusing on my own things. I don't think it's about one specific moment. Those responses unsettled him more than confrontation would have, because they offered no clear problem to solve. What he wanted was reassurance, confirmation that the structure still held, that I was still carrying what I always had, just temporarily tired. What he didn't understand was that I wasn't tired. I was finished maintaining something that wasn't mutual. As the weeks went on, concern turned into anxiety. The small inefficiencies that had appeared earlier began compounding. Plans required more effort. Decisions felt heavier. Emotional distance, once invisible, became palpable. That's when regret entered the room. Not spoken directly, felt indirectly. He began referencing the past more often. The good years, how well we worked together, how solid things used to feel. There was nostalgia in his voice, but also confusion. He didn't know what had changed, only that something essential was no longer available on demand. And still, he didn't ask the right question. He asked how to fix it, not whether it should have been built differently. That was the moment I knew it was too late. Because repair requires acknowledgement, and acknowledgement requires seeing not just the consequences, but the cause. What he was experiencing wasn't loss, it was exposure. Exposure to the reality that our stability had been supported unevenly, that what felt like a partnership had relied heavily on my silence, my flexibility, my willingness to carry weight without naming it. He began offering adjustments. We can talk more. I'll try to be more mindful. Just tell me what you need. They were sincere. They were also insufficient because they came after the reveal, not before it. They were attempts to restore equilibrium without revisiting the foundation. And I couldn't unsee the foundation anymore. I listened. I acknowledged the effort. I didn't dismiss his intentions, but I didn't move closer. Because proximity without understanding only recreates the same imbalance with better language. The panic escalated subtly. More check-ins, more attempts to engage, occasional defensiveness disguised as frustration. I don't know what you want anymore. I feel like I'm walking on eggshells. That statement told me everything. He believed the issue was unpredictability, not absence. He still didn't see that what was missing wasn't communication. It was consent. My consent to continue in a role that required my self-erasure. By then, the consequences had matured. I had already reoriented my life internally. My sense of self was no longer tied to being essential in the background. I no longer needed acknowledgement to feel steady, which meant no promise of change could compete with the clarity I had gained. That's why it was too late. Not because he failed to try, but because the trying came after the system had revealed its truth. You can renegotiate terms, but only if both people believe the original agreement was mutual. I no longer did. The attempts to fix things grew louder, more urgent, more emotional. And I remained calm, not distant, not cold, resolved. There's a moment when urgency meets stillness and realizes it has no leverage. That was the moment we reached. Nothing I said would have escalated the situation. Nothing I withheld would have saved it. The imbalance had already done its work. What remained was acceptance, and that cannot be rushed. When the confrontation finally happened, it wasn't explosive. There were no raised voices, no accusations, no list of grievances was delivered with shaking hands. It happened on a quiet evening in the living room we had shared for years. No audience, no urgency, just space. My husband asked if we could talk. His tone wasn't defensive this time. It was careful, measured. The kind of tone people use when they sense something important is already slipping away. I agreed. We sat across from each other, and for a moment, Neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't tense. It was heavy with recognition. He went first. I feel like I don't know where I stand with you anymore. I didn't rush to reassure him. I let the statement settle. Then I spoke. Not to defend myself, not to persuade him, but to clarify. I've been in the same place I've always been, I said. I just stopped compensating. He looked confused, not angry, not dismissive, confused. So I explained, but only what was necessary. I didn't recount every instance. I didn't justify my timing. I didn't revisit old moments looking for validation. I spoke in patterns, not events. I was reliable in ways that became invisible, I said. I adjusted so often that it stopped being noticed. And over time, my silence became the foundation, not the exception. He tried to interrupt once, to explain his intention. I didn't stop him. I listened. Then I continued. This isn't about blame, I said. It's about structure. And the structure worked because I kept it working. That was the first moment his expression changed. Not defensiveness, recognition. I could see him reviewing the past, not emotionally but structurally, replaying decisions, reconsidering assumptions. He said he hadn't realized. I believed him. But realization and reversal are not the same thing. He asked what I wanted. That was the question everyone expected to change everything. And in another version of the story, it might have. But my answer was simple. I want to stop being in a role that requires my disappearance. There was no ultimatum in my voice, no threat, just truth. He asked if things could be repaired. I didn't answer immediately, because honesty matters more than comfort. I don't know, I said. Not in the way you mean. I explained that repair would require more than new behaviors. It would require re-seeing the past without minimizing it. It would require shared ownership of imbalance, not just future effort. And most importantly, it would require time without guarantees. That was hard for him to hear. Because people often want resolution as proof of remorse. But resolution, when rushed, is just another form of control. The conversation ended without a conclusion. No decisions were made, no promises exchanged, no dramatic statements. But something essential had shifted. The confrontation hadn't created clarity. It had confirmed it. I didn't feel relief afterward. I felt alignment. Because I hadn't softened the truth to protect stability. And I hadn't weaponized it to create distance. I had spoken plainly, without heat. And when you do that, the outcome doesn't depend on persuasion. It depends on reality. We both knew that whatever came next would not be built on silence. Whether it would be built at all, that remained to be seen. I am not the woman I was when this story began. Not because something was taken from me, but because something was returned. Perspective. For a long time, my identity had been built around reliability, being the one who could be counted on, the one who absorbed complexity and smoothed over edges so others could move freely. Letting go of that role didn't leave a void. It revealed space. Who I am now is quieter in a different way. Not restrained, intentional. I no longer measure my value by how little friction I create. I don't confuse calm with connection. And I no longer assume that being understanding requires self-erasure. I still listen carefully. I still choose my words, but I don't disappear inside them. What surprised me most was how little bitterness I felt. There was grief, yes, but not for what was lost, for what had been misunderstood. I grieved the version of myself who believed endurance was proof of love, who thought being indispensable meant being cherished, who assumed silence would be read as grace rather than compliance. But I don't resent her. She did the best she could with what she understood at the time. Now, I understand more. I move differently in conversations. I notice when agreement is assumed and pause it gently. I ask questions without apologizing for them. I allow discomfort to surface without rushing to resolve it. Not as a tactic, as honesty. My relationships are smaller now, but clearer. I no longer overfunction to keep others comfortable. I let people show me how they engage when I'm fully present, not endlessly accommodating. Some connections have deepened, others have fallen away quietly. I've learned not to interpret that as a loss. It's alignment. At work, I am still dependable, but visibly so. My contributions are documented. My boundaries are explicit. I don't wait to be asked to be included in decisions that affect me, and I don't rescue processes that exclude me. That has changed how I'm perceived. Not louder, just clearer. In my personal life, I no longer rush toward resolution. I let understanding develop at its own pace, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable, because clarity earned slowly is more durable than reassurance given quickly. The most important change is internal. I trust my perception now. I no longer explain it away. I don't dilute it to maintain harmony. When something feels off, I don't rush to fix it. I examine it. That doesn't make me guarded. It makes me grounded. I don't regret how things unfolded. Not because it was easy, but because it was honest. Silence taught me what words never could. It showed me the architecture of my relationships. It revealed where I was valued and where I was simply relied upon. And once you see that distinction, you can't unknow it. Who I am now is someone who understands that peace built on disappearance is not peace at all. It's a postponement. I don't need to be chosen at the expense of myself. I choose myself first and let everything else align accordingly. That choice didn't make my life louder. It made it truer. There's a lesson people often expect at the end of a story like this. Something sharp, something definitive, a clear right and wrong. But real life doesn't resolve that cleanly. What I learned wasn't that silence is bad, or that speaking up fixes everything. It was something more uncomfortable and more useful. Silence works until it doesn't. My marriage worked because I was silent, because I absorbed, adjusted, and made things easier than they deserved to be. My silence created stability, efficiency, and peace, at least on the surface. And when I spoke up, everything did fall apart. But not because truth is destructive. It fell apart because the structure depended on my silence to survive. That's the part people struggle to accept. Some systems aren't broken by honesty. They're exposed to it. I don't tell this story to warn you against patience or compromise or being calm. Those are strengths. They matter. but they become dangerous when they're one-sided. When you're the only one adapting, the only one explaining, the only one holding things together quietly. At that point, silence stops being grace. It becomes labor, unpaid, unseen, expected, and expected things are rarely appreciated. The hardest truth for me was realizing that no one had forced me into that role. I stepped into it willingly, piece by piece, because it felt like love, because it felt responsible, because it felt easier than risking discomfort, until the cost became invisible to everyone but me. There was no villain in my story, just patterns left unexamined for too long. If you take anything from this, let it be this. Pay attention to what your silence is supporting. Ask yourself whether your calm is mutual or merely convenient, whether your understanding is returned or simply relied upon. And notice how people respond, not when you explain yourself, but when you stop compensating. That response tells you more than any conversation ever will. I didn't lose my voice when I was quiet. I lost myself. And finding myself again didn't require shouting. It required alignment, boundaries, and the willingness to let things change when they could no longer be sustained honestly. If parts of this story felt familiar, uncomfortably so, you're not alone. Many people live inside quiet imbalances because they've been praised for handling them well. But handling something well doesn't mean you should have to handle it alone. So I'll leave you with one question, not a challenge, not advice, just a question worth sitting with. In your life right now, what is still standing only because you're the one staying silent? And what might happen if you stopped? If you feel comfortable, share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes, clarity begins when we realize we're not the only ones who've been quiet for too long.